basically, the biological wealth of the planet or of a nation is the amount of biodiversity, and the biodiversity is the variety of species living in an area. So you could have a place that was, two areas that were exactly the same, and one of them had like 15 species, and the other one had 5 different species, and if the total number of individuals was the same, the one with 15 species is going to be the most biodiverse, even if the number of species was different. And the one with 15 species had fewer individuals, that one would still be considered the most biodiverse because it had the most variety or the most different numbers of species. And so a lot of the times we consider that our biological wealth of the planet or of a nation or whatever. So they estimate the total number of species on Earth to be between 5 and 30 million. And that's a huge jump and a huge change, right? There's a big difference between 5 million and 30 million. And the reason for that is they just really have no idea. Like the ocean and the bottom of the ocean and the rainforest, they're just really not sure how many species are there. And if you look at this little image, the dark one is how many species have been discovered, of how many they've discovered, and the lighter circle is how many they think are still out there, or the total. So if you look at, for example, insects, right? This dark circle is the amount of insects we've discovered, but then all of this out here are the insects that are yet to be discovered. So there's a lot. We haven't gotten all of them yet. And the smaller the animal, the more likely it is that we haven't gotten all of them because, they're harder to find. For example, if you look at mammals, right, we've basically discovered 98% of the mammals on the planet because mammals are usually big, they're easy to find. Same with birds, right, they're not too small. And so they're just easier to find. Although I have, since I've been teaching, I've heard of 2 different mammals that have been discovered. So we're still not all the way with the mammals, but we're definitely a lot closer than we are with all the insects because, they're just larger. They call them sometimes charismatic megafauna, which is just like basically like cute big animals. And so they're just more likely to be found by scientists. So that's at least kind of what we call biodiversity. So in North America, between 1642 and 2001, we've had over 631 species and subspecies go extinct. Okay, so that's a huge amount, and that's just in North America. So that's not, everywhere on the planet, just North America. So that's kind of a lot. And these pictures are just some examples of species that have gone extinct. I don't know all of their names. I know that this is the dodo. But I do know because they're not current species anymore, so we don't tend to learn about them as much anymore. So then we can talk about like why do we need to preserve biodiversity? Why do we even bother, right? Does it really matter? Does it really matter if we have a dodo or not? Does it matter if we have a rhino or not? Like how is that really going to affect us? So they give wild spaces and things a value, and they call it either an instrumental value or an intrinsic value. And so the instrumental value is if it benefits someone, if it's got some use to someone, okay? And this is usually anthropogenic or anthropocentric is what they call it. And that just means it's usually humans. We care if it benefits humans more than we care if it benefits like a frog or something. The benefit of a rhino might be, that it squishes plants and it increases the soil value or whatever. If humans aren't using that area, does it really matter? So it might not have an instrumental value because it has no benefit to others. Now, folks are using I'm trying to say, folks use rhinos, for example, for like safari, right? And then the folks that are conducting the safaris get money from the people that come and go on the safari. So that could be an instrumental value of the rhino, is that it's providing money for those people that are conducting the safaris. So you can usually you can find some way that it'll benefit a human. And then in addition to that instrumental value, we have the intrinsic value, and this is just the value for its own sake. So we need to preserve something because it belongs there, because it's native to the area, because it's not our job to decide who gets to live and who gets to die. All of those are kind of intrinsic values. Just the fact that it exists is enough. That means we should probably keep it around. So we can kind of talk a little more about the values. So these are some values that you can see. So for example, a value is a source of food or raw materials, source for medicine and pharmaceuticals, recreational, aesthetic, and scientific value, and then value for their own sake. And then which is intrinsic and which is instrumental. Okay, so these would be instrumental. Because they, they're useful to someone else besides the critter that we're talking about. And this would be intrinsic. Okay. Okay, now values as sources for food. So traditionally, we really have only used about 7,000 plants for food, which sounds like a lot, but of the millions of plant species that are out there, 1,000, it's not that many, right? In modern agriculture, we only use 30 species. There's really only about 30 different plants that we eat. And then 3 of them, wheat, corn, and rice, are about 50% of our global food demand. So of those 30, the top 3 make up 50%, and then the other 27 are the other 50%. And we estimate that there's probably 30,000 different plant species with edible parts that we could cultivate. But there's a couple issues with this, right? We need to find a species, we need to figure out how to grow them efficiently, and then we've got to overcome some sort of cultural bias, right? Because some folks might be like, I don't want to eat whatever it is, right? They don't, because they're not used to it or whatever. Just like, for example, insects are an excellent source of protein, but many folks, myself included, aren't super thrilled with the idea of eating insects, and that's like a cultural bias. So you've got to overcome that a little bit as well. A value for source of raw materials. So nearly 3 billion people rely on wood as fuel for heating and cooking. So that's almost half the people on the planet, because we're a little over 7, right? So it's not quite half, but it's pretty close. And then the demand for wood is increasing so rapidly that they're actually predicting a timber famine or fuel wood crisis in the next few years, where we don't have enough wood to cut down that is acceptable for timber and fuel. And we honestly, in the United States, we probably won't feel that all that much, but in other countries they probably will. Then we have a value for the source of medicine, and the rosy periwinkle is a really famous case study. This is the flower, this flower, and it basically produces these 2 chemicals, which kind of changed the face of treating childhood leukemia and Hodgkin's disease, because these chemicals give kids with these diseases about a 99% of remission if they use these 2 treatments from the rosy periwinkle, these 2 compounds produced by the rosy periwinkle. So a lot of folks then have started using that as like a rallying cry almost to like save the rainforest, because save the rainforest, we might not know which plants in there, they could cure cancer, because this plant was found to do just that. So then we can talk about value for the sources of medicine, which they have actually an actual, there's a branch of study called ethnobotany, and it studies the relationships between plants and people. If you have not read it, The Botany of Desire is an excellent book. And you can actually get it in audiobook. And Michael Pollan, the guy that writes it, he narrates it, and it's super good. He talks about how some plants, he kind of takes evolution almost from the side of the plant, like the plants have kind of molded humans to do what they want. For example, he talks about the cannabis plant. If it did not produce that compound that people like, basically to get high, the cannabis nobody would even know about that plant. But because it produces that compound, they basically almost like taught humans or convinced humans to spread the cannabis plant like all over the world. And it's one of the most highly cultivated plants in the world because of that compound. So it's kind of interesting taking it kind of from the plant side. But it's really, really good. There's a movie too. But like the book, the audiobook, you can listen to it like while you're driving or whatever. So these are some drugs that they've common plants or traditional plants. So it's kind of interesting. I'm just gonna, I'm not gonna read them all, but they have, codeine, aspirin, quinine, some of those. So it's kind of interesting. And then the value for recreational, aesthetic, and scientific. So this is kind of what I was talking about when I said the rhino might have that instrumental value for like folks that run safaris, right? It's a recreational kind of value. There's some places that are protected, and folks really like to go watch birds there. Okay, so that would be kind of a recreational value, or scientific, where we want to study these places. So those are instrumental values, but sometimes it can kind of help people with the intrinsic side too, because they get to know about those creatures or places, and then they were like, wow, we should really save this because it's really awesome. Excuse me. Hunting, fishing, and wildlife watching employs about 2.6 million people. That's kind of a lot. And it actually produces $108 billion in the U.S., so it's not a tiny amount, right? These recreational things. And then there's something called ecotourism that's kind of taking effect, which is where tourists visit a place in order to observe wild species or unique ecological sites. So it's supposed to be more like environmentally friendly, because you're like being one with nature, and you're not trying to destroy the area. You're just trying to kind of observe this unique ecological place. Like, for example, some folks are going to the Galapagos. I've heard of eco tours to even Antarctica. Some of these are actually starting. There's so many people going on them that they actually are starting to cause some problems for the environment, as much as they try not to. And then, unfortunately, a lot of the times the money from the ecotourism doesn't necessarily go to the native folks that live in those places. It tends to go to like companies that are, running those tours. So this is kind of what I was telling you about. So it brings money to poor areas, but it can pollute. For example, they're having to limit people that visit the Galapagos. And the same with Antarctica. I think like a year or so ago, John Oliver actually did like a little like commercial that was like, don't visit Antarctica, just watch the videos online, because it was, they are starting to disturb that habitat. And so instrumental value. So when we lose species or we lose biodiversity or species go extinct, how much are we losing? They think that it could be up to $78 billion annually. And then in very, very poor areas, losing these species is an even higher cost, because these people, they're actually like living off of these species. They're using them for firewood, or they're eating them or whatever. So it's a little more important for them. And then the intrinsic value. This is the part where should we save species just because, you know, it's not our right to kill them or whatever. So one of the things that humans can do that a lot of other species cannot is have like a moral compass or make moral judgments. Okay. So we can say, is it right to kill these animals? Is it, you know, we can kind of have these philosophical arguments. And then, so they also say that because of this, we have this special responsibility, and it can include basically having concern for other species. You know, usually a giraffe is not going to be like, oh, you should really keep that rhino because you know he's a nice guy, or it's a really, you know, it's important to have rhinos around. Giraffe doesn't really care, you know. But we can make these moral judgments. Some religions are actually promoting an ethical concern for wild species, and even though sometimes religion and science are at odds, this is actually a really powerful force because there are a lot of folks that, you know, go to church or, you know, believe in some religion or another. Um, and so all of these people listening to their, you know, faith leaders saying we should protect the environment is important, you know. And then there's this essay, I guess, called The Land Ethic by Aldo Leopold. It's okay. Um, And so how do we calculate biodiversity? We can calculate the number of different species. Okay, so we can say, you know, there's 35 different species in this area. That's how biodiverse is. But then you can also calculate something called, they call it species evenness. Okay, you may not have two ends. But basically it's okay, you have 35 species, but do you have one of this, two of this, and 75 of another species? Okay, that's not very even because there's that one species that is way more than all the others. Okay, so that would be not very species evenness. But if you have like, you know, 10 of this species, 10 of this species, and 10 of another species, that would be, you know, that would have pretty decent species evenness. So again, how many species have we made? This kind of loops back to that first, or how we found that first slide. We've discovered about 2 million species, right? And remember, I said between 5 and 30, so we're not even halfway there of the low number, right? We think there's about 270,000 flowering plants, about 950,000 insects, right? That's almost a million right there, just in insects, right? And the problem is there's this job or a type of scientist called a taxonomist, and they're actually the ones that gets a species and they classify it down. They say, oh, it's got this many legs, this many legs. Okay, it's not definitely not this guy, definitely not this guy, definitely not this one. Oh, maybe we have a new species. Okay, there's not a lot of taxonomists anymore. It's kind of like a dying art, and so it takes them a very long time to go through these species and, you know, look at their genetics and things like that. For example, I read just this week that there was a jellyfish that they discovered like 10 years ago on Dauphin Island, which is like my husband, um, or it was over 10 years ago, but he was on Dauphin Island and he had just left Dauphin Island and they found this jellyfish. And they just like within the last couple of years found out that that jellyfish is actually a brand new species, right? It took them that long, like 10 years, to go through everything and make sure and check through everything and make sure it was a new species, and it was. Okay. And that's again because there's not a lot of trained taxonomists. So why is biodiversity declining? It definitely is, but why is this? And then in particular, there's these critters called endemic species, and I say critters, but there's actually endemic plants, and they're found in one place and nowhere else. Okay, these critters, and when I say critters, I mean, you know, plants too, they're especially at risk because if they die out in that one area, there's not another population somewhere else. That's it. They're gone. And a lot of times these endemic species are very specialized, and so just a little change in the environment can really affect their survival. So in the North America, they estimate there's probably about 200,000 or so species in the United States. And believe it or not, we don't know that much about most of them. And then a third of these species are considered threatened, endangered, or already extinct. Okay, so these are ones that would, not the extinct ones, but the critically imperiled, the imperiled, and I think even the vulnerable, yeah, the threatened. They actually can be protected by the Endangered Species Act, but that's more difficult than it seems, and we'll get into that later. Okay, so right now, species are going extinct about 100, maybe 1,000 times higher than in the past. So they're dying more often than they were in the past. Whether it's our fault or not, it's happening. And so there's this acronym that they like to use in apes called. So when you're, writing down notes or whatever, kind of star this, something, highlight it, because hippo is really important, and they'll even ask about it on the AP exam. And it means it's the reason that species are declining, or the reason that habitats are declining. The first one's habitat destruction. The I is invasive species. P is for pollution. P is for population, and O is for overexploitation. So we'll kind of go over those briefly. So habitat destruction is the greatest source of biodiversity loss. So this is the main reason why we're losing critters, and this is for a few reasons, not just because we've, it's not necessarily because we're building supermarkets all the time, but we're fragmenting these habitats, so we're putting highways through the middle of them, we're converting them to something else, right? So we may take a forest and convert it to farmland. We may simplify these habitats a little bit. So for example, if you have like a tree farm, it's still technically like a natural area, but it's all the same tree, or agricultural lands, or all the same plant. And then intrusion, we're intruding into these natural areas. And so this is responsible for a little over a third of all known extinctions. And remember, there were 5. Hippo has 5 letters in it. So this one is, a little over a third. So the other 4 are the other, basically 2/3. And so we are converting these natural areas to farms, housing, shopping, marinas, industrial centers, all of these types of things. Agriculture is considered a conversion, right? Because it's not really a great natural area, and a lot of species aren't going to want to live there, and the ones that do are usually ones we don't want anyway. They're like pest species. We are fragmenting habitats, so we are taking these landscapes and we are using a lot of different land uses. You can see even in this picture, right? We've got all these different land spaces, right? What used to be one big forest is now all of these different little patches. Okay. It reduces habitat size, which means there's more edges. So like, for example, these are the edges of the forest right here. Well, if you're a critter that likes to live deep in the center of the forest, there's not that much space for you to live, before you get to an edge. And if you don't like living an edge, or if you're, say, like a tiger or something that needs a really large range, this spot may now be too small for you. Then we are simplifying habitats. Again, human use will simplify habitats. If we take even a managed forest, which is what I was telling you about a tree farm, it's going to result in a decline of species diversity. And then any animals that, for example, it's a pine tree farm, right? Any animal that doesn't live on a pine tree, or doesn't, uses whatever tree was there besides a pine tree, those species aren't going to survive in that area anymore, because their favored tree is gone. Then intrusion, so we have the lights on these cell phone towers can attract birds, then they'll collide with the tower. Sometimes they die, sometimes they just get hurt. And then they say between 1 million and 1 billion birds die each year from crashing into like glass windows in cities. So that's not a small amount. That's a lot of birds. Then invasive species, we have these critters that are called exotic or alien, invasive, non-native, All of those words basically almost mean the same thing, and they're critters that are introduced into an area from someone else. Okay, and these can be plants or animals. So, for example, off the coast of Georgia, we have a lot of lionfish, and these guys are from Asia, and they were brought over here in the aquarium trade, and they live in aquariums, but they are very poisonous, and they're very vicious. They eat almost like lots of fish in the tank, and they get pretty big. And so folks were buying them, and they were either eating their other fish or they were getting too big for their tank. Instead of taking them back to the pet store, which pet stores will allow you to take fish back, and they'll give you like store credit or whatever. They were just like dumping them in the ocean. And now there's like this thriving population of lionfish in the ocean. And I used to work with the Gray's Reef folks, which is a national marine sanctuary, and they even have a thing in September where they are now, it's a fundraiser, and they go out and they collect a whole bunch of these invasive lionfish, and then they feed them. They have like chefs come and they cook them, and it's like this big thing, and people pay like $100, $200 a plate to eat these different lionfish dishes. Apparently they're pretty good. I'm not a fish person anyway, so I haven't gone to the thing and eaten there. Invasives, they spread, they eliminate native species, so they kind of like take over a niche of the native species, and usually they're pretty they're generalists, and so they can survive in a wide variety of environments, and so they just kind of take over a niche, and the native species kind of just can't compete with this non-native species that usually has no native predators as well, because it's not from that area. And so these guys are not lionfish in particular, but invasive species are responsible for about 39% of all extinctions since 1600. These are some other different types of lionfish, invasive species. This is hydrilla. This is lantana. You guys may have seen this. They have a lot of times at like hardware stores. They're really pretty. I want to say this is Callirpa, but it's been a long time since I studied submerged aquatic vegetation, so I might be wrong. So in addition to these invasive species, it's kind of tied. We have something called aquaculture, which is farming of sea animals, and they produce about a third of all the seafood consumed worldwide. And sometimes the aquaculture species is the problem. So for example, like these are pens in the ocean where they're growing a specific type of aquaculture species. And people like to do this because it's a little cheaper, because they don't have to manage the waste. The waste just kind of flows out the side of the tank because they're like mesh containers kind of things. And they don't have to make seawater or anything like that. It's all in here. But then if these aquaculture species escape, and this is not where they're from, then now they're in the environment, and they can wreak havoc in the environment. We've always moved species, and in some places you can't distinguish between what's truly a native species and what's a non-native species. For example, almost a third of all of the plants in Massachusetts are alien or introduced, and so there's about 725 species that are non-native, but only 66% of those are invasive. This is actually the invasive zebra mussel, this picture. They're not super big. They're, maybe like if you look at your pointer finger, they're like that top part that, you have the two knuckles or whatever, the top knuckle to the edge of your finger, they're maybe like that big. They're not super big, but they are very, very, very invasive. And the annual cost of invasives is about $137 billion, because a lot of places you can't get rid of them anymore. For example, these are places in Florida, and they can't get rid of them. So they spray them with chemicals, or they, here, they're just like scooping up the hydrilla with this machine, And they just have to keep doing it over and over and over because they really can't get it all at once. It's going to be there forever, basically. And then a lot of times these non-native plants are difficult for herbivores to eat. And so we have these plants taking energy from the environment, and then that energy can't go up the food chain because those herbivores can't eat them anymore. Pollution, this is going to kill, obviously, a lot of plants and animals. There's what they call the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. If you listen to last week's recording, we talked about the nitrogen and the phosphorus cycle kind of causing something called eutrophication. And we talked kind of what causes this. But basically, this area of the Gulf of Mexico is like completely without oxygen. And so nothing can survive there because, you know, anoxia means no oxygen. So there's nothing, you know, they can't breathe. And if you're a plant, you can't photosynthesize without oxygen. Or you need oxygen to breathe, and then, you know, you need carbon dioxide. Anyway, both plants and animals need oxygen, and you're not going to have it in a dead zone. And then pollution can also spread disease, and they call this, in particular, pathogen pollution. So then we have the human population. Our human population, we talk about this a little bit. If you remember, if you've done your top 10 environmental problems discussion yet, but we talked about it a little bit in this discussion thread where a lot of folks were confused as to why population was put as a huge environmental problem because they thought that was more of like a social problem. And the issue is, as the human population grows, we need more places to live. We need more places to grow food. We cut down more trees for energy or whatever. And so, you know, we're causing this basically by our growing human population. If the human population was smaller, you know, we wouldn't need as much stuff. We wouldn't need as much places to live. We wouldn't, you know, produce as much pollution, on and on and on. And so, population can kind of cause some of the other aspects of HIPPO. So that's why, you know, overpopulation is considered a environmental concern. And then overexploitation, just overharvest of a particular species. We can talk about how there's certain fisheries, I don't know if I have this in here, that are totally gone, like they used to exist and they don't exist anymore because those species aren't even at a level where we can catch them anymore because they're so overfished. There's an illegal trade in exotic animals, and it generates about $12 billion a year. So it's the third largest illicit income source after drugs and guns, which is just kind of like crazy to me because, you know, you think of like drugs and guns being this like, you know, cartels or whatever, and it's like dangerous trade of illicit income, and then we have like pets, right? Which is like you see here, there's like turtles. This lady's got an alligator in her lap. This guy's got, what is that, like a cheetah or a in his with a chain, like a pet. And this is a sloth. So it's just folks can this illegal pet trade is actually almost as big as drugs and guns, which is just kind of crazy to me. The lady with the alligator in the lap cracks me up. And so what are some consequences of this overexploitation of these species? If you're a keystone species, your role is so important in the ecosystem. And if that species is removed from the ecosystem, you're going to have this huge cascade of effects that you would not expect just from removing this one critter. And so they call that a keystone species because they are so important to the environment. And so if you lose the keystone species, for example, the otter, right? If you lose the otter out of like the kelp forest in California, you're going to lose a ton. You're going to have this like, call it like a trophic cascade, or this huge cascade of critters that are going to follow because that otter was so important. So just because, oh, well, I'm just getting otters, you're not just getting otters because they're so important to that ecosystem. You're actually indirectly causing other species to suffer as well. And then another big problem with these declining species is a lot of times the species that survive are ones that multiply very quickly. They have lots of offspring. They multiply at a very young age. They don't have to be like really old to multiply, and things like that. And they just kind of release babies and they survive. Unfortunately, declining species are often really long-lived. They're really big because it makes them easier for humans to find and get. They're a lot of times they're older at first reproduction. For example, grouper have to be like 55 years old, 25 years old in order to reproduce. So if you've got a grouper that survived for 16 years and someone caught him, he's not going to have had a chance to reproduce, even though he did last for 16 years. And that's also why a lot of times it takes these populations a long time to recover, because you can't just like, oh, I'm having critters and then they have babies and then their babies have babies and babies. You know, that first generation takes 25 years before they start having babies, right? Scallops are another critter that they are really, people love to go scallop hunting, fishing. They call it fishing, but it's more like hunting. Scalloping is really fun. But the problem with scallops is they, when they reproduce, they die right after they reproduce. And so what they have to do is they make scallop season right before the time of year of which the scallops reproduce. And so all the scallops that are taken out of the environment for scallop season never got a chance to reproduce. So those, you know, whatever's left is the only thing that gets to reproduce, not, you know, all the ones that survive to adulthood or reproductive age or whatever, because, you know, nobody wants to hunt a dead scallop. Everybody wants to hunt live scallops. And so they have to have the season before they actually get a chance to reproduce that year. And so one of the indirect consequences of species loss or overexploitation is we kind of lose the species that we like because we're using them and eating them and getting rid of, we're, you know, consuming them. But when we reduce those species we like, sometimes it leaves niches open for pest species, and then pest species populations actually increase. So we're actually not only are we losing the ones that we like, we're causing the increase in species that we don't like. And so that can cause, you know, a huge problem. It's not kind of an unintended consequence of overexploitation that some people maybe don't think of.